The time of dealing with the environment, dealing with climate change is now. It's not 100 years from now, 50 years from now, it's now. It has become important for me to figure out how to make that translation of that knowledge. These are the difficult questions around climate change. Not that it's happening, it's about political change. A big limitation that remains true in academic discourse around climate change that frustrates academics is that they produce enormous amounts of knowledge about climate, and that knowledge doesn't translate into knowledge for wider communities, and it doesn't produce change. And it doesn't do it on a time horizon that the crisis demands. And so one feels like you're knocking your head against a closed door. It's like the cruelest trick of history that those countries that have already experienced the impacts of colonialism, that continue to experience, that haven't benefited from globalization, these same countries are the ones that have been most deeply impacted by climate change. Canada has gotten away with seeming to be a country that pays a lot of attention to the climate in a serious way. Nothing could be further from the truth. I don't think in Canada a Canadian would be able to think about Canada in relation to other extractive superpowers. That's despite the fact that if you were to kind of chart these things, it's one of the major oil producers on the planet now. The absolute significance of energy and of a certain kind of energy to the far right in many places, but especially in those places that are extraction economies, has to do with that feeling that appropriate type of national identity, of ethnic identity that is being lost, goes back to this moment of raw extraction.
Hello, I would like to welcome you to our new format, IGRec Talks. My name is Felix Jaitner, and our guest today is Imre Szeman. It's very nice to meet you, Imre.
Good to meet you as well.
Imre, you're a professor of human geography. You're inaugural director of the Institute for Environment, Conservation and Sustainability at the University of Toronto. But you're also politically active. You have served as a climate critic for the Green Party of Canada. So do you see yourself more as an eco-activist or as a scientist or both?
Wow, I did not expect this question. I think both is the answer. I suppose the movement into politics was as a result of some frustration about the reach of academic ideas, the impact of academic ideas for publics, and at least my felt necessity of that happening. So I spend all my time around people that are doing brilliant work, and I recognize that work, it doesn't show up in public debates. And the longer I've been doing this as a professor, the longer I've been doing the work that I've been doing, now 25 years, at a certain point I just got frustrated with this and I wanted to experiment with joining formal politics. So when you say activist, I'm not sure that I'm an activist. So with the Green Party, it's a political party in Canada. It does have seats in the Canadian government as well as provincial governments. I did run for election. I was not elected in the 2021 election. But simply being in a different context means that I hopefully I can impact debates even in some kind of small way publicly. Activist, maybe at some level, I would say that elevates my work to be more important than I think it is. I think activist work is really important, but I would say politics, academic and politics, I'm still much more of an academic.
Then let's speak about your understanding of academia or a public academic. Why is it important for a scientist, for an academic, to take a public stance on socially important issues?
Let's think about what the point of a lot of academic work is, especially if one is a humanist or a social scientist. If you're a social scientist, if you're an anthropologist, a sociologist, political scientist, you're investigating issues that are ultimately of importance to the publics that you are serving. If you're especially if you work in a public university system like the one in Canada. So what does a political scientist study, for instance? Maybe it would be about the efficacy of political systems, of some kind of political systems. Perhaps it's about whether immigrants get to be involved in political decision-making, formal political decision-making to the degree that they should, those kinds of issues. So if all that you do is study those issues that are of immediate importance, that's the reason why you're studying them, and you do it to build a career, it doesn't seem to me to be very interesting in the end. What's interesting is trying to take that knowledge and to translate it back into the political sphere. I find that that happens much less than one would expect. So being part of formal politics, I can count on one hand how many times somebody either in the Green Party of Canada or in other parties would make reference to an academic. And actually, I don't even need a hand. I would say zero. There are some writers that are quasi-academics. They have a foot in academia and in more public discourse. They have much more impact than academics do. So I'm thinking about somebody like Naomi Klein or Bill McKibben, who's much more of an activist, but certainly can speak to academics. Now, academics, there's not an obligation necessarily. That's not what their role is. Their role is to generate information and knowledge. But that knowledge, I feel at least an impulse. Maybe everybody doesn't have to do it, but I feel an impulse to make that alive in some kind of way. And I especially feel that because I'm looking at environmental issues. And I'm looking at issues that are, there's a time horizon. The time of dealing with the environment, dealing with climate change is now. It's not 100 years from now, 50 years from now, it's now. So it has become important for me to figure out how to make that translation of that knowledge.
Before we will talk about your academic work and also your focus on environmental issues, let's still come back to this specific environmental crisis that you have already pointed out, because it's really the first time in human history that we as humankind have a very limited amount of time to act in order to prevent the worst outcomes of global warming, which will be felt very differently all around the globe, depending on geography, depending also on the country's capabilities to adapt, which is usually very closely connected to the economic situation of a country, whether it is a rather rich country or not. But also, well, society is very differently affected by climate change. Those who are very much kind of accelerating global warming, they are, and therefore also in charge of, or kind of contributing to climate crisis, are usually those who are well off in the society, very who have higher incomes and better jobs, in contrast to working class, which is lower incomes, but is also less contributing to climate crisis. Is this lack of awareness also maybe a reason, because the research on climate and environmental issues does not really have an impact on political decision making? Because you were describing these spheres of the academic world and the political sphere as being kind of not really divided, but there's not a strong debate between these two, and they're not really affecting each other the way they should, probably.
I think there's ample knowledge about climate change and its causes and perhaps even what to be done about it. That has come from the sciences, I think, over time. It's something that has become, I think, quite solid in the public imagination. I think it's more of the specialized work that has not really translated. And it's also the work of social scientists and humanists that have not translated. So just knowing about climate change and about the effect of its effect on natural systems and the change of those natural systems and the fact that it affects human beings, that's well known. Everybody will always say all the science that needs to be done has already been done. The harder task is some of the things you pointed to, which is, well, how do you mobilize people to change? Why don't they change? What are the limitations or restrictions on individuals and on societies? How do those differ? How do those differ across societies and inside of societies? These are really all questions that have been part of the discourse for a long time. They're about social change itself. So when I heard you just now describe all of those differences within societies about that, like the responsibilities for climate change and the impact on climate change, I was thinking to myself, it sounds like, in a different language, like Karl Marx. Mm-hmm. Some people benefit, others don't. In the case of Marx, the issue was, how do you mobilize those who don't benefit? How do you get them to understand they don't benefit so that they change the system? I think in many ways we're facing the same kind of question. And if we frame it that way, the issue is not around climate change. It's again about social change. How do you make that happen? How do you make that happen around knowing? How does that knowing translate into action? What are the limits to knowing? I suppose it's these kinds of questions. They're really difficult. These are the difficult questions around climate change. Not that it's happening, it's about political change. How does that happen in relationship to knowledge about climate? Maybe that's even the wrong place to be looking to. Maybe we should just still be talking about social change. A big limitation that remains true in academic discourse around climate change that frustrates academics is that they produce enormous amounts of knowledge about climate, and that knowledge doesn't translate into knowledge for wider communities, and it doesn't produce change. And it doesn't do it on a time horizon that the crisis demands. And so one feels like you're knocking your head against a closed door. But then the issue really becomes, how do you communicate things? Does knowledge even cause anything to change? So I feel like we're kind of, we know the right questions, we're asking them in the wrong way. We're wanting something from our knowledge that it doesn't quite do. We should be thinking more about how it takes effect. Kind of brings me back to your question around, do I do politics or activism? Do I do knowledge? It's why, again, I see both of them are necessary. Mm-hmm. When I go and do political work, it's as a way to test out the work that I'm doing in my own field of study. What do people think of it in whatever way they can? People that I meet at their front door when I go to canvas, when I go around shaking hands and so on. How might I be able to make that happen more powerfully? Does it matter when I make it happen more powerfully? Do people change substantially? But perhaps we can continue to have this discussion. I'm going on too long.
Yeah. You've already mentioned that you are, as an academic, you're working on climate environmental issues. I would also like to say energy humanities, but also social and political philosophy. So why are you specifically working on climate and environmental issues? What has caught your interest, especially working on these particular fields?
So as I was saying to you earlier today, my starting field of study is in philosophy. I did a PhD with under the supervision of Frederick Jameson at Duke University in, I suppose, history of ideas. And in my PhD, I really looked at the formation of specific kinds of different new ways of political organization in the post-colonial moment. So I'm broadly interested in politics, political theory, social theory, and in how we organize human societies so that they benefit the most number of people in them, and how to produce human flourishing. So that's the big picture, okay? Now, I think your question's already pointing to this in some ways. If one is interested in human flourishing, if one is interested in producing more equitable and just societies, it's impossible, I feel, to avoid dealing with climate and the environment. You cannot have a equitable and just society at the present moment unless you think about how to address the climate crisis. Climate will impact different communities to different degrees. It is exacerbating current inequalities. It seems like a cruel, it's like the cruelest trick of history that those countries that have already experienced the impacts of colonialism, that continue to experience, that haven't benefited from globalization, these same countries are the ones that have been most deeply impacted by climate change. It's like their experience gets worse and worse and worse. And how to make those countries and those people have a better situation without thinking about the impact of climate change is just impossible. So that's what led me to it first. It's to think about, well, how do you produce the kind of political outcomes that I would like? So let's say broadly, much more socialist economies and countries. How do you make that happen when you're faced with this existential threat of climate change? There's the big existential threat, right? We're not going to be able to live on the planet. Big existential threat. But there's a more, I don't even know what to say. How can you say anything against the big existential threat? But there's another one, which is, how do we achieve those social goods that we had long wanted to achieve, given the circumstances that we live in now? So I think that's what led me to it. I hope that's kind of clear. And so then, of course, there's all kinds of questions then to look at with respect to the environment and energy, as a result of once one recognizes its importance, then there's all kinds of questions that need to be addressed about it so that you can understand its significance, energy's significance, the environment's significance for social and political justice.
Let's talk about the country where you live in, Canada, and its specific environmental situation, so to say. Canada is considered to be an extractive economy. The country is heavily shaped by the exploitation and the export of natural resources. Entire regions like Alberta are shaped by the oil economy and very much depend on the oil price. And the life of probably a lot of people in Alberta and Canada is dependent on this development. But in your work, you focus also on the cultural aspects of extractivism. You don't see extractivism merely as an economic or political process. So I would like to know, how is extractivism, how are energy relations woven into people's everyday life? How does it shape people's system of value? Specifically in Canada, of course, you can also answer maybe more globally, but what have you observed studying these issues?
I feel like I first need to say the following, which is I've been interviewed a lot, and these are the most compelling set of questions I've received so far. You've given some real thought to the questions, honestly. And yeah, so I just wanted to note that. This is This is an interesting conversation for me to have. It's making me think harder than usual. So Canada and culture, maybe just to give a bit of a framing of Canada as a specific, as a place with respect to the environment and with respect to energy. So Canada, I think, in the global imaginary is usually thought to be a kind country, developed country, a country that plays fair. Canadians are nice, you know. Just noticed coming into the EU, I came through Zurich, and when you show your passport at the border, they're almost immediately disinterested. That is to say, they just want to get on to the next person because how could you possibly do anything? That's a problem. You're a Canadian, boring, go on your way, okay. Now I say that because I think that in the global imaginary, except for perhaps those people that know about energy or know a lot about environmental issues, Canada has gotten away with seeming to be a country that pays a lot of attention to the climate in a serious way. Nothing could be further from the truth. Canada is one of the highest emitters per capita. It has done almost nothing to reduce these emissions since signing the Paris Agreement. In fact, in some parts of the country, the per capita emissions have increased. It's generally over the whole country remained flatlined, but only because in other parts of the country there's been some decarbonization. Okay, so we have a situation of a place that emits as highly as, say, the Gulf states. Now, why is all that background important to your question about Canada and culture? Canadians recognize that they are in an economy where extraction is important, often in a kind of an abstract sense. Now, so let me just say that sounds strange to say it that way. It sounds strange because in the first few pages of the daily newspaper, of any daily newspaper, there are questions related to energy, especially. Less so mining, which is another major element of the Canadian economy, and beyond. So many of the major mining companies on the planet, and some of the worst ones, are based in Canada. Okay, so there's lots of talk about energy. At the same time, I think Canadians, especially in the major cities, don't really see that it has very much to do with them. It's not how they experience their everyday lives. It's not what it's like to be in a daily life as a Canadian. You're interested in sports. You're interested in what you do with your friends. You like going out to restaurants. You like being in these sophisticated global cities like Toronto or Montreal. And so you live on a day-to-day basis. You don't live this extractive economy. Some of the people that are in places like British Columbia, if you are somebody that is in forestry, you yourself depend on forestry for your livelihood, or if you work in the oil fields, it matters a lot to you. For everybody else, it doesn't really matter. Finally, we're getting to culture, okay? So it is, without question, Canada is an extractive economy. When I first began to think about this in relation to culture, I wanted to see where it shows up in Canadian culture. Are there films about mining? Are there films about extraction? I don't mean documentaries, I mean feature films. Have there been throughout history? Are there novels that have seen this as a major feature of the Canadian experience? Are there places, if a Canadian wanted to start to understand what drives individuals or what the social experience of being in an extractive economy looks like, is there a place you could turn to read about it? And my initial answer would be no. that at the most prevalent examples of Canadian culture, you can't see immediately any kind of reference to extraction. Major Canadian writers, Alice Munro, winner of the Nobel Prize, Margaret Atwood, others, they don't talk about extraction. They don't talk about taking oil out of the ground. They talk about other things. They talk about interpersonal dynamics. They talk about small town experience. They talk maybe about big cities. It was surprising to me that it just wasn't part of the dynamic of Canadian culture. Now, you could, if you wanted to do deep analysis, deep reading, you could start to find it, but it's not something there that Canadians see as part of their own everyday experience. And that was compelling to me, interesting to me. Why was this not the case? That has changed. There are many novels, especially, or poems as well. Poets have attended to this, but only relatively recently. And I think that has been because of recognition of the climate crisis first, and then an attempt to try to situate where their country fits in relationship to it. But I suppose my initial interest was this big absence, and attempt to try to figure out why that's the case. Why was it not being figured in cultural products? Was that one of the reasons why there was this misunderstanding of Canada internationally that I was telling you about, but also by Canadians? So I think Canadians themselves would not see themselves as a problem on the world stage. Okay. Now, when I say that, even as kind of the communities I move in, we talk all the time about Canada as being extractivist. Politicians talk about it. You know, it's important for us to continue to do this to generate wealth for the country. Right. But on an everyday basis, that's not what people look to. In fact, I think if you were to talk to an average Canadian, well, I know this from polls, it's not speculation. I don't think Canadians see themselves as a problem. I think they believe that they're doing things to make the world better, when in fact they're one of the most egregious countries in the world when it comes to climate change.
So if we are to characterize extractivist culture in Canada, would it be correct to say there is none? Or there is a negation of extractivist culture, or it's rather underground?
I mean, until recently, I would say that's the case. Again, you could find it in different places if you then started to look. Part of what the energy humanities did, I think, is to say energy matters for human experience, it matters for culture, and as a result, it should be everywhere in culture. And that if you did start to look, you could see that it was there, even if it's in its absence. Its absence too signals something about how important energy is at any given moment for some kind of cultural imaginary, and that already tells you something. When it's not there, it's not a problem in certain kinds of ways. Part of the impulse of trying to say that it wasn't there in culture was to get people to start to look to see where it was. And I think people sometimes misunderstand that initial claim of that we don't talk about energy that much. The point was then to kind of look for it. But does it have an extractivist culture? I hadn't thought about that term either. I would say that there is now explicitly novels, poems, still less so films, but part of that is just because Canada has a very its cultural industries remain dominated by having the U.S. present right to the south. That produces enormous amounts of cultural products. It's hard for them to compete. So media, films and TV, there aren't very many examples, and so you're not going to find that in there. But certainly novels do deal with it now. But is it a kind of popular imaginary as opposed to kind of an elite culture that still reads serious fiction. I'm not so sure about that. Now, when you say extractivist culture, certainly it's present in day-to-day discussion, but it's there as a site of political conflict and of economic conflict, much more than cultural conflict. So I suppose I'll just leave it at that. It's seen as something that matters in some places and not in others. It's not seen as something that is ubiquitously experienced by Canadians. I think that in the major population centers in Ontario and Quebec, where it's primarily clean energy now, it's hydro energy especially, but also nuclear energy, very little use of fossil fuels. The problem is treated as solved, and the issue then becomes localized, and it's those other places that are the problem, and that then just kind of churns into a complicated political debate. But this doesn't seem to be a cultural one. I'm making really, really big claims, and anybody that actually focuses on these things will probably disagree with me, but I would still stand by these.
Yeah, no, I was, maybe I should also explain why I was asking this question. The Russian example, for example, is quite different, as the country itself, this especially also the government portrays itself as an energy superpower, for example, right? So energy has there is a very strong, not only political, but I would even say societal discourse around energy, and also the country's role as an energy exporter, and also political influence that is connected to it. There would also, I think, not the same direct discussion, but kind of, if we look at the Gulf states, for example, the extraction and the significance of energy for the countries of the Middle East is very present.
Yes.
So that was the background of my questions, and it's very interesting that in Canada it seems like this debate is kind of externalized to the centers of extraction. So the urban population seems to live a very different life that is very much kind of divided from the probably day-to-day experience of people living in these extractive economies and regions. That probably also poses the question once again why you work on environmental issues, because the question how this is translated, the fact that we have observed climate change into societal development, this is probably very different if you ask someone living in a big city like Toronto or Montreal or Berlin, and in an area of extraction.
Sure, the divide will be there's just like a simple basic divide. So one would be, in a city, you worry about climate change, you try to make the city more habitable, and you try to make CO2 emissions per capita less. So that might be having more bike lanes. You know, I say this with a smile on my face because I can think of no other city on the planet but Toronto that is trying to remove bike lanes at this present moment, which we can explain, we can talk about later. But I think, the experience of those cities is not an extractive experience. Now, again, if you were to talk to any given Canadian, they would say, resource extraction matters to the overall economy of the country. I don't think in Canada a Canadian would be able to think about Canada in relation to other extractive superpowers. That's despite the fact that if you were to kind of chart these things, it's one of the major oil producers on the planet now. Or maybe you can even say that, but I guess I'm trying to point to kind of deeper sensibilities. So yes, it's absolutely important. People recognize that. At the same time, well, day to day, how is it important? Who is it important for? In Alberta and British Columbia, it matters for labor, though we could even talk about that, whether that's actually the case. But it certainly matters for money, and it matters for money for elites especially. It's where they get their value from. It's where they get their capital income from. So that's kind of one divide. I suppose I hadn't thought about this in relation to a place like Russia, but there's perhaps, this might be going too deep into Canadian politics, but Canada's a federal system. What that means is it's the provinces they're not politically independent, but there's a specific divide of what the provinces are responsible for vis-a-vis the national government. The provinces are the ones that have control over natural resources. The federal government does not. The federal government can only intervene in questions around natural resources if it's something that crosses the border between provinces. So a pipeline that goes between provinces, immediately you have to get federal approval for it. If you're just doing extraction in a specific province like Alberta, the province does that labor. The province benefits from it in terms of taxation, and so on. Okay, has produced massive differences of income in different parts of the country. I think in Alberta, per capita income is twice as much as in other parts of the country.
Wow.
If you go to Calgary, you can see it. Okay, in Calgary, in all of Alberta, there's no provincial sales tax, so things are cheaper there as well. In Alberta, because of the importance of a specific resource, which is oil and gas, it matters a lot politically. It matters to people working in it, to everybody working there, because there's, through a kind of string of connections economically, the entire system depends on it. But it especially matters to the oil industry and to companies that extract. Okay, so that's one division. Another thing to think about is, I think again in a different way than in Russia, and in fact in different to most other extractive economies. In Canada, extraction is it's private industry that does the extraction. So if Canadians have a discussion, they do it in this abstract terms that the government, extracts. You have figures about how much extraction Canada does, but it's really private companies that do it. All that the government does is give out contracts to allow private extraction to happen. Now, I say all that again because if there's a private company extracting, the main people that benefit are shareholders in the companies. Those shareholders can be anywhere. But really the dynamic then is about return on capital investment. And that further confuses everything, I think, in Canada. There's this sense of extraction being a national issue of national importance. It is, but in fact, it's the responsibility of specific provinces. It's seen, I think, for most Canadians, imagine it being something that governments are involved in, and governments make sure that Canadians think that way. But in fact, it's private companies that do the extraction and private companies that benefit. So this is why you have this very confusing set of discourses that are easily used, especially by the right, to confuse who is responsible for things that are happening in Canada. So it's curious. It's more like Australia or the United States or the United Kingdom in terms of extraction being private. It's so different in its history from Russia that I don't know how easy it is to map it onto one another. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Let's talk about your scientific work more specifically. Reading your texts, I came across two important terms. The first one is seeking energy justice, and the second one is energy humanities. Please explain what they are all about, which I can imagine is a big question to ask. But and what I would also be interested in, why and how do they help us to understand the world better?
Okay. Let me take energy humanities. I'm going to try to define this again. I've done it a million times, but I'm going to try to do it as clearly as possible. The humanities, what are they about? They're about the study of cultural objects broadly, right? The humanities deals with human experience, plays, novels, poetry, philosophy, religion, questions around how human beings experience the world in some kind of fundamental way, and how they express it in narrative form. So that's what the humanities are about. Now, at its core, the energy humanities wants to say the following. The significance of energy for social systems, the way that it has a determining impact, not a determinant impact, but a determining impact on the unfolding of modernity and the form that it takes, and the practices and experiences of modernity. So modern experiences about using ever greater amounts of fuel, fossil fuel, and the capacities that that produces. If that's the case, it has to find or should find expression in those narratives that I've just described, in those narratives of human experience. The energy humanities does kind of two things in relation to that. So one is to look to see where that might be the case. And kind of coming back to an earlier point you said, if it's not expressed, that's interesting too, because it tells us something about what our understanding of energy has been socially for much of modernity, which is that it's not important. It's not so important to human experience that we'd have to talk about it. It becomes more interesting and more obvious as we get closer to the present. We see it more often expressed in narrative, in human narrative. So that's just kind of one of them. In the narrative of modernity, where do we see energy experience? Where do we see it expressed? How do we see it described? What does that tell us about the importance of energy for modernity? The second thing is to say that energy should be part of any study of the humanities going forward. So if it's as important as I'm saying, then you can't write about philosophy. You shouldn't be able to write about philosophy without having to pay attention to energy. You shouldn't write a novel without having something about energy in it. I don't mean necessarily in some explicit way. It's not like you have a little side part that makes a point to kind of name energy, but it should account for how important that is. Maybe let me go at it a slightly different way too. So in Civilization and Its Discontents, Sigmund Freud in 1930, he describes us, human beings at that point, moderns already, as something like demigods. We are able to see far distances with telescopes. We're able to see microscopic things, with microscopes. We can travel through the air with airplanes. We can go at incredible speeds with cars and with trains. We can do things that in Greek mythos only demigods could do, if not gods. 1930, we've yet to really start using energy in the intense way that we began to do after 1945. And certainly it was in 1930, a human being on average used nowhere near the amount of energy per capita that they do now. So if we were demigods in 1930, what are we now? Like exactly what are we? Okay, we must be close to being gods. Okay, if that's the case, then we have to think about energy as part of our experience. We have to think about how fundamentally it shapes our relationship to everything. And it's significant and important to think about it in terms of narrative form. So I don't know if that gets across to. So as opposed, and then when it comes to justice, there's energy justice in fields of academic study outside of fields of humanity, and that has kind of two forms, I think. So one of them has to do with this difference in the amount of energy that exists around the world. So I think if I have the figures right, it's not going to be quite right, but in poor countries in Africa compared to Canada, Canadians use 100 times more energy per capita. So per like capita. 100 times, yes. Not everywhere, but even I would say with richer countries in Canada, let's say it's 5 to 1. That just produces more capacity to do all kinds of things, not just for social and political development, but even for how an individual experiences the world and their capacities and their sense of autonomy and their ability to shape their own experience and so on. So if that has become the kind of sense of what a human being should be able to do, what a Canadian does, I don't think people should all be like Canadians. That's not what I'm trying to say. But the opportunity to be able to use energy at that level, to be able to shape one's own experience and to shape one's social experience should be available to everybody. Insofar as it hasn't happened, that produces kinds of disequilibria, which are not just about the amount of funds somebody has, not just per capita income, but around human experience. So one kind of justice is to make sure that everybody gets to use energy. Not necessarily dirty energy, but energy. Perhaps what that might mean in terms of a just transition is that some of us use a lot less energy than we do now to make room for others to use a lot more energy. The other energy justice, the other energy change that has to happen is the impact of extraction on some communities versus others, on any kind of extraction. So if you live near a site of oil extraction, if you live near a mine, others benefit and you suffer. And so a kind of justice would be to attend to that difference and to try to ameliorate it as much as possible. So those are what those two phrases, I would say, are about.
Following upon the question of energy justice, I'd be curious to get to know more about your research project, mapping and amplifying policy pathways to keeping fossil fuels in the ground, because there have been various initiatives to prevent the development and extraction of new oil deposits. For example, probably most prominently, the Yasuni ITT initiative in 2007, which was put forward by the government of Ecuador, aiming to promote the reduction of emissions through the non-exploitation of fossil fuels, and thereby protecting biodiversity and social development in the Yasuni National Park. And unfortunately, this initiative has failed. It was not possible to raise enough money internationally to kind of replace the sum that the Ecuadorian government was expected to get from oil extraction by this an international support. But still, there have been successful mobilizations of ecological movements against the exploitation of resources. So, thinking about also energy justice and a just transition towards a socio-ecological society. What are you researching within your project? And also thinking about the amount of energy used per capita, which is so high in Canada, and what does it tell us how is it how people also in Canada respond to these kind of research, which could probably touch a lot of politically very problematic developments.
Yes, it does. So that project that you're talking about. It's really led by my colleague Angela Carter, who's a Canada Research Chair at Memorial University now. She was at a different university before. And it has, I think, a simple premise. The premise, it is similar to the one you're describing, which is that the real impact that one can make on climate change with respect to energy is to limit extraction or to eliminate extraction or production rather than managing the end point, which is the impact, its consumption. Much of the discourse around climate change and energy in relation to climate change has been about mitigating the use of fossil fuels, right? So what happens when you already have CO2 in the air? Okay, well, there's ways you can deal with that, perhaps, but the easiest way to deal with it is to never have used it.
Right.
Yes. So the project is to look at countries or to look at regions that have decided to no longer extract. There are very few of these in the world at the national level. There are some that have been tried out and then have been repudiated, or they've gone back and forth. So Costa Rica is one example, and Colombia is another. There are some countries that are more open to doing bans on extraction. So I think Denmark is an example in Europe that no longer has extraction. So it's just a kind of question of if it's the case that the best solution to burning energy or to limiting CO2 production from energy is to not ever have used it, how do you make that happen? And it's to try to look at how do the policies, where they ever come into place, how does that work? How can you make that come into place elsewhere? Now, I say that there haven't been many examples of this working, and I said actually carefully at the national level. I don't know if you've heard of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty movement.
No.
It's an organization, an activist organization based out of Vancouver. And over quite a long time now, what they've been doing is all around the world getting cities especially, but also regions, subnational regions, sometimes countries, to sign this treaty where they commit to never engaging in extraction practices. If you were to look at the number of places that this treaty now has signatories from, it's quite substantial. It's becoming more and more important. And it's a way that some activists have thought that it would be productive to raise awareness about precisely these kind of extraction bans. And I suppose that's kind of another place that we would look to. So yeah, I would say that's the question. I'm more of a sub person to that project, but Angela's really the one that's the lead.
I see. If you allow, I would like to discuss another term with you, because we're talking a lot about what you also would probably describe as petroculture, right? Yeah. There is the term petromasculinity. The term comes from the political scientist Kara Daggett and is intended to illustrate that masculinity in the 20th century was essentially linked to fossil capitalism. So emblematic is in this context are big cars, for example, and as a symbol of status also. And the promise of the authoritarian far right nowadays, as I see it at least, is to preserve and restore kind of the good old days and the associated gender relations, right? So does petroculture in your point of view, stand or represent this kind of agenda? And would a transformation towards a post-fossil society based on renewables pave the way for a progressive turnaround? Are these things, in your opinion, connected, or rather not? Could it be also a technocratic green transition that does not really encompass a transformation of our democratic system?
Let me start at the end, because I think, I mean, you've explained it all already, but I'll do it anyway. One of the key things that colleagues and I, who are part of this After Oil collective, what we've been writing about in our last book called Solarities, and in one that we're finishing now, which will be called, I think it'll be called Against Renewability, is to look at how you try to create or preserve the possibility of a transition, a green transition in fossil fuels that will also carry with it or inform or support other kinds of transitions, social transitions, instead of this kind of technocratic green capitalism that you're describing. Okay, that term, against renewability, means not that we're opposed to there being clean energy.
Yes,
we're opposed to that technocratic shift. Mm-hmm. And indeed, the book that I just finished writing that appeared in the fall, called Futures of the Sun, are examples of the technocratic attempts at creating futures that look a lot like the present in terms of their values, their forms of cultural expression, their self-understanding, their economies, and so on. So, and there's different kinds of them. So there's not just a single one. So one of these kinds is actually has to do with the right. Okay. Now, petromasculinity is as you say, is a phrase that Kara Daggett, my colleague Kara Daggett, came up with, and it's really brilliant. It's a brilliant analysis, and actually, now that I think about it, it contains within it everything you might want to know about with respect to energy humanities and petrocultures. It's a great example. So typically, ideas about the development of masculinity have not paid attention to energy, have not paid attention to how the presence of energy might have shaped that in some kind of way. So in the energy humanities, we'd say, you're missing something if you don't do that. And for all these reasons that I've been describing, right? We're now gods of some kind. We're not demigods, according to how we read Freud. So what Kara does is say, well, okay, what does masculinity look like when we think about it in relationship to energy? And indeed, you get this idea of a certain kind of masculinity linked to car culture, linked to big trucks, linked to, images of what people working on oil rigs looked like, linked to driving, and so on, right? So petromasculinity could be about convoys. I don't know if you know these movies from the 1970s that were about truckers moving on the road in big fleets. It could be about anything like 1950s car culture as well, or at least fantasies and images of that. Young men underneath their cars in their driveways, fixing their cars on their own so that they can go around cruising in them on Saturday nights and causing trouble in cities and so on. So certainly, I think I don't think there's any way to object to what Kara is saying. There's definitely that connection of masculinity to petroleum culture. Just as an aside, I hope I'm not going on too long. In Canada, 85% of the population lives in big cities. In Canada, 4 of the 5 most vehicles that are sold that have the highest sales are trucks. Okay? You don't need a pickup truck in a city. You don't need it in Toronto. But there's a lot of pickup trucks in Toronto. If you're in Calgary or Edmonton, where my mother lives in Calgary, classic suburb, every driveway has a truck in the driveway. Every house has a truck in the driveway. People don't haul stuff around in it. Maybe they take groceries in it. Well, why do you have the truck then? It's about power. It's about an expression of either like some kind of physical might. It's definitely linked to masculinity. Now, coming back to your complicated question, I hope I'm doing it justice. Why in the current far right, especially in the US, why is it that it is so important for the Trump government this time around and the last time around to reinforce and support the oil industry? Okay. And not as a hidden part of its agenda, as front and center. Both elections, Trump said, day one, drill baby drill, right? Day one. Okay? So it's clearly part of the self-understanding of that government and of the far right to what it's all about. It sees transition as some kind of threat. It doesn't understand what it's about, potentially. It sees it as a threat, not because they can't make money necessarily out of certain kinds of energy transition. They see it as a threat to whiteness. They see it as a threat to a certain kind of order that existed at a certain point. They see it as a threat to a way of life. And like any reactionary government, they think of some other moment where things were beautiful and in harmony, things weren't messed up by change, there weren't immigrants perhaps coming in the same levels. And in the US especially, I think, that imagination the car comes into play, right? It's kind of like right back to the 1950s again. It's when everybody has a big vehicle, when they don't have to worry about how much fuel that they use, when they're not worried about emission standards, when you can use as much resources as you want, when there isn't some kind of anxiety and danger on the horizon about climate change, which is present to them even in their denial. If you have to deny it, you know it's there, right? So I'm certain it's certainly the case. All those kind of connections that you're making are definitely there. It's about the absolute significance of energy and of a certain kind of energy to the far right in many places, but especially in those places that are extraction economies, has to do with that feeling that the appropriate type of national identity, of ethnic identity that is being lost goes back to this moment of raw extraction. And I wonder if that's true as well of Russia, if that's the case. My guess is yes. So yeah, those are my kind of. So kind of to go back to it, you can see how played out in cultural form are these questions of energy, are these questions of extraction. Here in terms of how one understands a political subject, how one understands gender relationships, I think how one understands legitimate political status versus illegitimate status, and so on.
Imre, thank you very much. It has been a fascinating conversation. We will continue that also now, but now you're released.
I'm released?
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to ask? I will say again, like I think your questions were more measured and thought-provoking than often I get, because I think that what you were doing is trying to make not just go through and ask for definitions or to just kind of go through my work, but to try to do some complex mapping of these questions in relationship to current developments.
Right. And kind of to try to place your work and also the way how you see yourself as a public figure, but also as a researcher in this context, and how you perceive the developments and how and why you essentially study them, right? So I think that's always a very interesting question, and you have done a brilliant job answering them.
Okay, thank you. I hope I didn't know if I was a little bit unfocused at times. So I'll just say one other thing. I don't know if this has to be, you can continue to record it, but what I find fascinating about the current Trump government, I will be curious to see how it plays out, is that there is a tension built into it from the beginning around a disavowal of transition, of the necessity of it, of the reality of climate change, and so of any possible need to do anything about it. Not only the need to do anything about it, but kind of that reactionary return to like even more extraction. Like, let's extract as much as possible. Let's have those men back in the coal mines coming out like all covered with dirt and then going to the bar and so on. Whatever those sensibilities are from movies and so on, let's have that, because that's true America, right? Pure production of some kind. So that will be in tension from the beginning with some kinds of movement to transition that is like simultaneously built into the economy and the politics of the country through the Inflation Reduction Act of the Biden administration, but also because of the presence of Elon Musk in the government, and Musk having very different kinds of commitments to, if not climate change, I think that's become confused, but certainly in terms of what electrification means. Okay, whatever else is happening, Tesla is not going to make gas-powered vehicles. So how do you make sense of that? How does a government make sense of that when it's starting to perhaps have impulses that it can't quite figure out what that will look like? When you have somebody that donated $250 million to the Republican Party's election cause, that person, Musk, will want outcomes that benefit him, and completely putting the brakes on transition, and indeed moving back to some kind of fantasy petromasculinity, is not going to match that. The geopolitics of the moment, in which transition matters deeply, where other countries are betting on transition and on various kinds of clean technologies as what is going to be the leading dynamic in their economies, and the US stepping out of that, that is something that the US, I don't think, has any sense yet of how to play properly. And nor do I think they know how that's going to impact them, because of this fascination around petro-whiteness. That's another category we should talk about. But there are lots of people that are committed to that transition and for whom it's important. People in the business community, including a lot of Republicans. A lot of Republicans whose constituents have benefited from getting resources to produce battery plants or solar power plants in their counties and their states and so on. They don't want to see those go away. So I think it's easy to first imagine we have this new Trump administration. It's kind of a Trump administration #1 on steroids. So it's just going to be even like more reimagining, let's get back into the mines,
which they learned the first time around. Nobody's interested in mining anymore in the US. It doesn't make money. So drill, baby, drill, part 2. But now things are very different. Now transition has moved along in other places. And while you need fuel still, you need fossil fuel still. Other places are, much of the world, I'll even say, is positioning itself to no longer need those fuels precisely because of its geopolitical benefit. So it will be an interesting period of time to see how these various kinds of dynamics play themselves out.
Right.
So yeah.
It's definitely going to change, I think, and very quickly within the next decade, even already with visible outcomes. And that's also I think you have already set out very important understandings of how to conceive them and also how to work on these issues scientifically, but also politically. Thank you very much. It's been a very great discussion. Thanks
for excellent questions, Felix.